opportunity for education as the boys as much as possible. For instance, when I was just a little girl, I came home crying from school one day because my male teacher would not teach me long division. He said that as a girl, I wouldn't need it. Well, my parents immediately took me out of that school and they started teaching me at home. Now, I know that there are many fine parents out there in the Zoom land that have plenty of experience homeschooling their children today. So you can appreciate the sacrifice that my parents made. And I was truly grateful. For high school, I did attend a private boarding school in Philadelphia. And I just loved Philadelphia. There's just so much history and culture everywhere you turn. But unfortunately, when I was 17, my parents' fortunes fell and I had to quit school and start working. I taught school until I was 29, and I enjoyed it for the most part, until I realized that my male co-workers were making 4 times what I was making. I determined to speak at the teachers' convention that year. Of course, women were not allowed to speak on the floor, but I gathered up my courage and I stood up to be recognized. But they were shocked. And don't you know it took those gentlemen a full half hour to determine that I could speak? But when I did, I calmly pointed out that as long as women were deemed unfit to be doctors or lawyers, but perfectly acceptable as teachers, that the entire teaching profession would suffer a lack of esteem. Well, you could have heard a pin drop. They were flabbergasted that a woman could make such a valid point. The spell was broken when 3 fine gentlemen walked down the aisle to congratulate me. It was my first public speech. You can imagine my elation, and it was a small victory for women. Quakers also believe that each individual has a duty to work towards justice and social reform. To that end, my daddy regularly invited the thinkers of the day to our home for supper and debate, and I was always invited. That's how I met Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave, a social reformer, and a brilliant elocutionist, which means he was a mighty fine talker. Frederick Douglass is the one that inspired me to join the anti-slavery lecture circuit. And along the way, I became an engineer on the Underground Railroad. Now, I know that you know what that is because you had a stop here in your beautiful downtown New Hope, Pennsylvania, home of your fine library. And that's how I met the bravest person I have ever known, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was also an escaped slave, but she didn't just talk about it. She returned south many times and personally, at great peril to her own life, escorted almost 100 slaves to freedom. What many people don't know is that later on, Harriet became a spy and a general in the Union Army. How's that for pushing the boundaries of what a woman can do? But for all my reformist feelings, you may be surprised to find out that what finally turned me into a feminist was temperance work. Now, temperance is a movement against the consumption of alcoholic beverages. And I know that many a fine folk out there do enjoy a nice glass of wine or a martini here and there, and it hardly ever causes harm. But at the time, it was a real problem. Men regularly squandered their families' money on drinking and gambling, and then beat their wives in a fit of temper. And any money that the wife did make could be legally confiscated to pay his debts, even before she could buy bread for her children. Now, does that sound right to you? Certainly not. And that's when I joined the battle for my sex. Unfortunately, I was not there from the very beginning. No, I did not attend the historic Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 that was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It was the first convention in the world to focus on women's rights. But unfortunately, I was still teaching. But 3 years later, when I met Elizabeth Cady Stanton at a temperance meeting, we hit it off like two peas in a pod, even though we were as different as can be. For instance, Lizzie was short, plump, married with a brood of 7 children already, while I was tall, still slender, and single by choice. Don't get me wrong, I do admire men, but I was looking for a man to be an equal partner. And men like that were very rare indeed. But Lizzie and I, we complemented each other perfectly. For instance, Lizzie was a wizard with a pen and a tireless cheerleader for me. And they tell me I had a public charisma and an ability to galvanize people into action. I always found that ironic because I was never really comfortable speaking in public. But for the next 50 years, I wound up traveling all over this country, lecturing and demonstrating for the cause. In fact, Lizzie and I worked tirelessly side by side for 50 years until poor Lizzie died. We worked for women's rights and especially for the vote, because we knew that the vote was the linchpin of it all. After all, if your rights are granted by a man, they can just as easily be taken away again by a man. Now, I do apologize to the fine gentlemen in the audience today if that sounds a bit harsh, but it is a fact, and it is our shared history and must be honored. Slowly, so slowly that anyone in their right mind would have given up, we wrested our rights from an often indifferent and hostile public and government. Honestly, they thwarted us at every turn. Some of the younger gals who came after me were even thrown in jail for long periods of time and force-fed. Some of them were force-fed when they went on hunger strike. Now, I have been told that force feeding is a punishment akin to hell. Now, I never did have to endure a punishment like that. But when I was 52, I was arrested for voting. Now, I knew I was going to be arrested, but I was tired of waiting for the permission to vote. So I claimed my right under the 14th Amendment, which states that all citizens have the right to vote. Well, I was a citizen. You'd be so proud of me. I bullied my way past the men at the table there, and I entered the booth and I voted. Of course, I was arrested a few days later and put on trial. It was a sham mock trial. The judge hardly listened to the testimony, and he instructed the jury to find me guilty. Afterwards, I refused to pay the fine. But the authorities refused to press the issue because if they had thrown me into jail, which was the alternative sentence, I would have been able to take my case to the Supreme Court. And of course, they didn't want that. Finally, in 1878, when I was 58, an amendment was first put forth in front of the Congress for women's suffrage, and that means the vote. And I am so proud of this document that I want to read it to you word for word. It has 2 sections. Section 1, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. But alas, it failed to pass. In fact, it took another 4 decades to pass. 40 more years of tireless work. Of course, I was disappointed. We had worked so hard. As most of you know, I did not live long enough to see that amendment pass in my lifetime. But I never doubted that it would eventually, and I never, ever gave up. Interestingly, it was World War I that turned the tide in our favor. The war effort slowed down our campaign just as the Civil War had done, rightfully so, but it shone the spotlight on the work that women were doing that helped to save the war. Honestly, I don't think we could have won that war without the work that women were doing. It proved once and for all, without a shadow of a doubt, that women were just as deserving as full citizenship rights as the men. Finally, I feel that I keep saying that, but finally, on August the 18th, 1920, 100 years ago today, Tennessee was the final state needed to ratify that document, and it became the law of the land. And not a single word of the original document had been changed. My dear, dear friends, as you have heard here today, I experienced more disappointments and setbacks in my 50-year fight for women's rights than most people experience in their lifetime. And I gave up my personal life to do it. With all that traveling and lecturing and demonstrating, there was hardly time for a regular life. But I didn't regret a thing. Instead of focusing on the setbacks, we focused on the progress we were making despite the setbacks. So my message for you today is, if you have something important that you need to do, something you feel strongly about, recall my life. Work very hard and never, ever give up. And in that way, failure is impossible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Our next speaker today was also a suffragette on the other side of the pond, but she actually was very influential in the passage of the 19th Amendment over in the United States. So I would like to welcome to the floor Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst. Emmeline?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Librarian. My name is Emmeline Pankhurst, and I announce myself to be a proud hooligan. First of all, let me congratulate you on this noteworthy anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Our struggles together are not in vain. I was born in 1858 in Manchester, England, at a time when many struggles were going on for human freedom and rights. Luckily for me, I was born to parents who were social reformers, abolitionists, supporters of women's suffrage. One of my earliest memories as a little girl was holding a lucky bag to collect money at a bazaar to raise money to relieve the poverty of newly emancipated slaves in the United States. Despite my parents' support of rights for women, I remember the time when I first became aware of the inequality of the sexes. When it came time for me and my siblings, my brothers and sisters, to go to school, my brother's education seemed to be a matter of serious importance. Mine and my sisters were not. My education was to be centered around making home attractive. Why was that my job and not that of my brothers? One night, while pondering this issue, in my bed, pretending to be asleep, my parents came in the room to kiss me goodnight, and I heard my father say, "What a pity she wasn't born a lad." Well, it was all I could do not to sit up and voice my objections, but I kept quiet and I resolved never to regret the fact that I was a woman. At the age of 14, I begged my mother to take me to see the famous suffragist Lydia Becker, who was talking about the women's right to vote. And after that, I never doubted my life's cause. My parents sent me to a progressive boarding school in France at the age of 15, thank goodness. I learned bookkeeping and chemistry, and in addition to those other skills of homemaking. And I started to increase my liberal awareness. I returned to England and I started working on women's suffrage, and I came to know Dr. Richard Pankhurst, an advocate for women's suffrage, freedom of speech, and other social issues. We married in 1879. Contrary to those who think that suffragists are emotionally disappointed and frustrated beings, my marriage was very happy, and we had 5 wonderful children. I was deeply immersed in my home and in my family, but never gave up my involvement in my community. I thank that partially to my husband, who believed that family and society need the services of women. Together, he and I organized the Women's Franchise League to advocate for married students' right to vote in local elections. Sadly, my husband died after a short illness. Ladies and gentlemen, there were many turning points in my life when I realized that women's lives would never be improved until women got the right to vote. I was appointed as a poor law guardian. The poor law was brought in during the reign of our wonderful Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. We oversaw the workhouse for poor people of all ages. Many of the women that I saw there were good, honest, hard-working souls. In my opinion, they worked harder than the men, who ended up in the workhouse through no fault of their own, because women's wages in life were far inferior to that of men's, or because their husbands, when they died, the husbands' pensions ceased to exist, so they became penniless. After my husband's death, I was also appointed as the registrar of births and deaths, not marriages, you will note. That was considered a man's job. When I was confronted with many young girls of 13 or 14 years of age who had conceived illegitimate children forced on them by their fathers or by older relatives and were responsible for those children. Something had to change, and it was only going to change if women were given a say and women had the right to vote. In 1902, I was lucky to meet Susan B. Anthony in Manchester and hear her talk. Her words had a tremendous effect on my daughter Christabel and me. "It is unendurable," my daughter said after Mrs. Anthony's departure, "to think of another generation of women wasting their lives begging for the vote. We must not lose any more time. We must act." And we did. In 1903, my daughter Christabel and I formed the WSPU, the Women's Society Social and Political Union. Our motto was deeds, not words. And we worked only in the matter of women's suffrage. We started out by attending political meetings, heckling the Liberal government candidates who were running for re-election, shouting out our requests for the rights of women to vote. We lifted banners up high and hid in rafters for hours to get into those meetings. We marched on Parliament and requested meetings with the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith. It is the right of all citizens to petition Parliament, but the government sent the police against us at every turn. The government spoke to us in platitudes and prevaricated on our requests. In 1905, my daughter Christabel and a fellow suffragist, Annie Kenny, were thrown out of the Liberal Party meeting, and Christabel decided this was the time to act. She spat at a policeman. She was jailed. Our peaceful militancy began to take shape and move. I want to mention to you at this point that I visited your beautiful country many times to give speeches. In 1913, I gave a speech in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm going to read a part of that speech to you to show where our progression to militancy came from. I appealed to you as Americans at that time, and I likened your struggles in the Revolutionary and Civil War to our Civil War for women. As long as women consent to be unjustly governed, they can be. But directly women say, we withhold our consent. We will not be governed any longer, so long as that government is unjust. We could not and we would not give up, and our tactics changed and we became more militant, and our government grew more desperate, but never once considered giving us our rights as citizens, although they made a pretense of considering it. Over the next years, we broke windows. Window breaking in England, you should know, has always been regarded as an honest expression of political opinion. We set fire to pillar boxes. We destroyed the orchids at Kew Gardens. We burned churches. We burned the tea house in Regent's Park. And one of the most well-known things we did, some of us burned the summer home of David Lloyd George, a member of the cabinet. Now, I'm going to say to you, we were always careful that our peaceful militancy focused on damage to property and not humans. Aren't the rights of women as human beings more important than the rights of property? Well, you might say, and people did at the time, these women have earned their jail sentences. But consider, male protesters before us and at the same time as us, the working classes asking for better working conditions and higher wages, the Irish asking for home rule, were at times praised by the same politicians as trying to make their voices heard, while we, the suffragists, were jailed as common criminals. We requested our rights as political prisoners and engaged in hunger strikes against the prison food in our refusal to be treated as common criminals. As you have no doubt heard, the government employed the brutal torture upon us through force feeding, which caused physical and mental damage to many of us, and I believe the premature death of some of our suffragists. Popular sympathies were with us. The government was at a loss what to do. You may have heard of the notorious Cat and Mouse Act, which is known as Prisoners Discharged for Temporary Ill Health in 1913. If a suffragist fell ill, she was released. The police watched her, and when she was healthy again, they dragged her back to prison. In 1913, I was released and rearrested many times. So how did we finally win our cause? Just as in your country, World War I helped our goals. In 1914, we called a truce with the government and we went to work to help the war effort. 4, what good is the right of vote for women if no country remains for them to vote in? After the war, no doubt because of our work that we did, the Representation of People Act in 1918 extended the vote to men over 21 and to women over 30. In 1928, that suffrage was extended to all women over 21. Now, as you know, I died in 28 before the right to vote was expanded. Many people may question whether our violent militancy helped our cause or hindered it. I have no such doubts. We were there to make the world a better place for women today, and I believe we did. Votes for women.
Thank you, Emmeline. It was lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you.
My name is Alice Paul, and I suppose you could say I'm probably out of everyone here a local girl because I was born across the river in Maple Shade, New Jersey on January 11th, 1885. And you may know me from history as the suffragist who saw the 19th Amendment come to fruition. One of the most frequently asked questions I get when I speak to groups like this is, when did I finally decide to become involved with suffrage? Well, for me, there was nothing else. You see, I grew up in a devout Quaker family, and one of the guiding principles of our faith was that of gender equality. That is how my brothers and sister and I were raised. My mother used to take us to suffrage meetings when we were very young. We were given equal chores around the household, and we were given equal education opportunities. I actually attended Swarthmore College, which was founded partly by my grandfather. It was a Quaker school, so it was coeducational, and men and women both received the benefits of lectures from brilliant professors. And I actually became involved in student government, which kind of really planted that seed of activism inside of me. It was a wonderful experience. Another fundamental principle of the Quaker faith is that each of us is born with special talents. You may have heard it referred to as an inner light. It is incumbent on us to use our talents and our skills to make the world a better place. It did not take very long for me to decide how I wanted to use my inner light, because while I personally enjoy gender equality, it was obvious that this was not the case for most women. See, in those days, women truly had very little say in the direction of their lives. If a woman happened to be working in an accepted career, such as a nurse or a teacher, she was expected to give it up if she'd married. Her husband controlled the family finances and made all the decisions regarding children. And if the marriage were abusive, women had very few options. It was next to impossible to divorce your husband. And if you were to leave, you could be prohibited from seeing your children, financially ruined, and publicly shamed. The laws of the day did very little to help women. And though women made up half of the country's population, we had absolutely no say in the laws that governed us. We had no vote. It was clear to me that as a people, we could never progress if women did not have equal rights. And that became my mission. After Swarthmore, I traveled to England to get my master's degree in sociology. And this journey was eye-opening in more ways than one. While I was a student in Birmingham, I happened to be walking around the town and I saw a young suffragette speaking on a street corner. The crowd was brutal, especially the men. She was jeered at, spat at, had obscenities slung at her. Objects were even thrown on her, and all for having the audacity to speak out in favor of women voting. It became very clear to me that even though I was an American, this wasn't simply a problem that was happening in our country alone, but an issue for women around the world. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum, and it behooved us to meet each other and to talk to each other and to learn from each other. So I introduced myself, and the young woman's name was Christabel Pankhurst, Emmeline's daughter. I was curious as to what they were doing in England to advance suffrage, so I joined their cause. Now, as you heard from Emmeline, the suffragette movement in England was quite different from the one in America, and for a Quaker, it was somewhat alarming. Women, according to Emmeline, had been petitioning for suffrage for years and years and years to no avail. And I think you have a saying going around now that what is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? Well, it was now necessary to change the tactic. Women needed to be heard by their deeds, not words. And so we were demanding attention by breaking windows, chaining ourselves to cars that belonged to members of parliament, blowing up mailboxes, and getting arrested and imprisoned. While in England, I was imprisoned about 44 times. I did not tell my mother about this. But what I learned was that the civil disobedience was actually working. The women's movement was getting attention. Suffrage was gaining support. And now the women were not only talking about getting the vote for their daughters and granddaughters, but they were talking about the day that they would walk in and cast their ballot. This was exactly the sort of energy that we needed back in the United States. Now, I would be terribly remiss if I didn't acknowledge one of the greatest things that ever happened to me did happen in England, and that was that I met my dear friend, Lucy Burns. I met her, of all places, in a police station in England after we had both been arrested for breaking some windows. She was wearing an American flag on her lapel, and as a fellow American, I got to talking to her. She was just as passionate about suffrage as I was, and we became very good friends. We were different as night and day. I am incredibly stubborn. When I sink my teeth into something, I do not let go of it. Lucy was more diplomatic and malleable. She knew how to talk to people. But together, we were one spirit and one voice, and we fought for suffrage side by side for many, many years. So Lucy and I returned to the United States, and we promptly joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, this movement had been in the United States for a while, and it was focused on winning the right to vote, but on a state level. And also this group believed that that was their goal. Getting women the right to vote was their end goal. But not for me. We needed a national amendment granting women the right to vote in order to ultimately have equal rights in every capacity. We needed national attention, deeds, not words. So Lucy and I organized a parade. Nothing violent about the parade. There was still a little too much Quaker in me to resort to any sort of truly violent tactics. But there was nothing violent about a parade for women's suffrage right in Washington, D.C., right down the center of Pennsylvania Avenue, with a beautiful young lawyer by the name of Inez Milholland leading the parade astride a beautiful white horse. We had women from all over the country joining us. We had floats, we had banners. And the fact that this parade happened to coincide with President-elect Woodrow Wilson's arrival in Washington for his inauguration was absolutely no accident. We planned that to get his attention. We needed to demonstrate to him that women's suffrage was here long before his arrival and would be around long afterwards if need be. So when Mr. Wilson arrived, the train station was relatively empty because everybody was off watching the parade. You see, today, you have many different organizations holding marches on Washington, but back in 1913, this was unheard of. No one had ever tried something like this before. And we were peaceful and we were organized, but it wasn't long before the men lining the route became abusive and shouted at us and said vile things to us and got in our way. They deliberately obstructed our progression. There were police there, but they did absolutely nothing. So the parade ended somewhat chaotically, but thankfully our message was heard loud and clear. The next day, our parade made headlines all over the country. Women's suffrage had finally become national news. We needed to keep up the momentum. Hold the reigning party accountable. That's what Mrs. Pankhurst had taught me. Even though the NASWA believed in courting politicians, especially the Democrats, because they seemed to be sympathetic to the suffrage cause, and Mr. Wilson was a Democrat, we needed to keep the pressure on him. So we picketed the White House. Again, this was totally unheard of. We took turns standing outside the White House gates, quietly and peacefully holding our signs. Signs that said things like, Mr. Wilson, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. Wilson, when will you give women suffrage? Again, totally unheard of. Now at first, Mr. Wilson seemed amused. He would walk by and give us the tip of his hat and smile. And occasionally I was invited in to speak to him. Now, I don't feel Mr. Wilson himself was opposed to suffrage, but it really did not rank high on his list of important things. Basically, he listened, patted me on my head, and sent me on my way. I guess I can't blame him, because at this juncture, the United States was about to enter into the war going on over in Europe. I suppose he was somewhat distracted. But really, how could this man call himself a defender of democracy when the United States was not a democracy for half of its citizens? And if we were to go away quietly, the whole nation would see how women's suffrage could be so easily dismissed, and we would no longer be taken seriously. My mother had a saying, when you put your hand to the plow, you don't let go until you get to the end of the row. So we stayed and continued to silently picket the White House, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. Well, people were no longer amused. They felt we were anti-patriotic. And again, we were subjected to insults and abuse, and we were arrested. Now, initially, the arrests were meant to frighten us, but we persisted. And as we persisted, we were sentenced to jail. And the time spent in jail increased and increased. I, for example, in October of 1917, was arrested for carrying a banner. A direct quote from Mr. Wilson himself that said, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there can be but one choice. We have made it." I was accused of obstructing traffic. And so I was sentenced to 7 months in jail. The Occoquan workhouse was a horrible place. The conditions were completely unsanitary and unsafe. I was placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. They tried to give me bread and water, but I was on a hunger strike. I refused to eat it because I also believed that we were to be treated as political prisoners. The prison did not agree. At the end of 2 weeks, I was dragged to the hospital wing and force-fed. This is something I would not wish on my worst enemy. A block of wood was placed in your mouth. 4 guards held you down. A feeding tube was inserted down your throat and into your stomach, and some milky hot liquid was funneled through, scalding you, burning you. If you vomited, and who could help but vomit, the tube was inserted through your nose, and the whole process was repeated over again. It was brutal and barbaric, and it happened again and again, all because we asked for the right to vote. One night, things got particularly bad. The prison warden had become very frustrated with our frequent arrests and the revolving door of suffragists that came in and out of the prison. He had had enough, and he ordered the guards to treat us incredibly cruelly. We were clubbed. We were beaten. Guards would grab us by the napes of our necks and slam our heads into the bars on our cell. My friend Lucy was handcuffed and manacled to the bars above her cell, and she was forced to stand there all night on her toes. One of our suffragists, Mrs. Alice Combs, became so upset by seeing all of the beatings that were going on around her, she actually had a heart attack, and she was denied medical treatment until the morning. This became known as the Night of Terror. And as news of the Night of Terror was released to the press, people were outraged. They could not believe the treatment that we were enduring in that prison. Even Mr. Wilson was appalled, and we were shortly released afterwards. And though this was horribly brutal, this helped the cause. More and more people became aware of suffrage, and they were sympathetic to the cause. Mr. Wilson himself decided to champion the cause. Now, just because the President of the United States puts a bill before Congress does not mean it's going to get passed quickly or easily. The bill was voted on 5 times over the course of 18 months before both houses finally passed it in June of 1919. It now needed the ratification of 36 states to become law. By the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified the amendment. By August 1920, we had 35 states, and now the vote was coming up in Tennessee. Tennessee is a southern state. The southern states were not particularly friendly towards suffrage, but the bill did pass the state Senate, and then it went to the House. We were hoping for a tie at best. But fortunately that morning, a young 24-year-old representative by the name of Harry Byrne received a letter from his mother. The letter advised him to vote for suffrage. Harry personally was a fan of suffrage. He had no problem with women voting, but he was a good politician. He believed that he represented his constituency and that those constituents did not want suffrage. His mother convinced him otherwise, and like a good son, he listened to her. The amendment passed, getting 50 out of 99 votes. It was ratified, and women now had the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was hard-won, as you've heard. Many, many women over many, many years worked hard, suffered atrocities, and pushed forward. I can only ask of you to honor all of us by making sure that during every single election, you get out there and exercise your right to vote. We're not telling you who to vote for. That's up to you. But please, go out and get your right to vote. Failure is impossible, but you should never take your rights for granted. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm going to unmute everybody, and if you have any questions, or you can unmute yourself according to this, and if you have any questions, we will do our best to answer them. I don't think I can unmute people. Okay, does anybody have any questions for us? Okay, well, thank you again for coming. It was a pleasure to see you all.
Thank you so much for
Thank you so much.
sharing that with us. It's wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you, and
Thank you.
vote.
Okay, we will. Thanks so much.
Alrighty.
Thanks.
Bye all.
Thanks for
Great
coming.
job, ladies.
Great.
Great
Very
job. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy
Hi,
anniversary.
Barb.
Hi, Kat. Thank you,
Hello.
Kathy. Thank you for the information.
Welcome, our pleasure.
Okay.
And it was
I gotta go.
Alrighty, bye-bye.
A wonderful history lesson.
Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye now. That's all. Which one?
Leave at the top. Can't you read?
It's still on.
Well, they're still on.
anniversary. There's my mom. She made it.
Oh, yay, okay, wonderful.
I didn't even know you were there. Mom, you have to unmute yourself.